I'm Scott.
I'm Bill.
And we're the Trade Guys. You're listening to The Trade Guys, a podcast produced by CSIS where we talk about trade in terms that everyone can understand. I'm H. Andrew Schwartz, and I'm here with Scott Miller and Bill Reinsch, the CSIS Trade Guys.
On this week's episode, Bill and I discuss two research reports. One sponsored by the Scroll Chair about the authorities that a President Trump returning to office would have immediately with regard to raising tariffs. And secondly, a more thorough study of supply chains and their performance and to the extent to which they contributed to inflation during the pandemic. All this and more on today's episode of The Trade Guys.
Welcome back to The Trade Guys. I'm here with Bill Reinsch and Scott Miller once again. For today's episode, we're going to look at two recent papers that dive into the weeds of a couple big, complex questions that are of real relevance to trade policy. Now, of course, you listeners could just go read these papers, and we do encourage you to do so after listening to this podcast. But won't it be more fun to have Bill and Scott walk you through them? So we have a new piece up on CSIS.org called Making Tariffs Great Again. Does President Trump have legal authority to implement new tariffs on U.S. trading partners and China? That's by Warren Maruyama, the former USTR General Counsel, Lyric Galvin, and of course our very own Bill Reinsch. Bill, I'll turn to you first to answer the question posed by the title. Does Trump have the authority?
Well, we could make this a very short podcast and just say yes. And, see you all next week. But like everything else in trade, it's a little more complicated than that. But I think the answer really is yes, although there's a bunch of footnotes. One question, we get asked this question a lot, if Trump is going to do this, because he does have a tendency, which is a little bit unusual amongst politicians, to actually do what he promises to do. He doesn't always succeed, but, he tries more than the average president. So there's an expectation that if he wins, he will actually attempt to put in a 10 or 20% across the board tariff and 60% plus tariff on China. And I don't know, maybe 200% on John Deere and whoever else he threatens over the next several weeks. So we get asked a lot, can he do that? And I think the answer is yes. And there's a number of different ways that he could do it. The paper counts 5 of them. Partly it depends on when you want him to do it. And a lot of the questioning that we get is revolved around what could he do on day one? Because he's promised to do a number of things on day one. Is this one of them? And the best answer to that is if he wanted to do it on day one, he would have to use the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEPA, which necessitates declaring an international economic emergency, which then gives the president a bunch of powers, which include import-related powers. So I don't think there's much debate that a tariff would be within the scope of the authority granted by IEPA. The debate would be rather, and there will be a debate, if he imposes tariffs under any authority, I'm sure he'll be sued. Generally speaking, in the U.S., if you want to sue, you have to have standing. It means you have to show that you've been harmed or will be harmed by this action. I think an across-the-board tariff will produce plenty of people with standing. So there's no shortage of people that will complain and file suit. In that situation, the issue will not be whether imposing a tariff is one of the powers that resides in IEPA. The issue will be whether an emergency that puts a tariff on everybody is actually within the intent of the statute. There, I think one could have an argument, but the reality of all these is that it'll be litigated. It'll probably end up in the Supreme Court. And so the question for companies is not so much where it will end up, but what will happen immediately. And the issue in legal terms will be, can somebody find a judge that will grant an injunction that will prevent the tariffs from going into effect while the litigation proceeds? If that happens, then it would be status quo. Nothing would change until there's a final adjudication. In this case, most people think, and Warren and Lyric and I think agree on this, and the paper indicates this, it would be very hard to find a judge that would grant an injunction. In order to get an injunction, you essentially have to show two things: that you would suffer immediate and irreparable harm, which you could probably do in this case. But the other one is that you're likely to win the litigation. And that's a lot more complicated because IEPA gives the president very broad powers. And I think the reality is that it would be very hard to find a judge that is willing to second guess the president on an economic security or national security issue. The tendency of judges is to say, the president has access to better information than I do. He has access to intelligence. He knows all this stuff. If he says there's an emergency, who am I to say he's wrong? So I think it would be hard to find an injunction, but I know it will be litigated. And at the end of the day, I think it's unlikely that president would lose, but he could. It really is outside the realm of the statute. I'm so old, I was actually in the Congress when they passed this. The idea at the time was, emergencies actually arrive. Crises show up where there's not time for Congress to act. And we ought to give the president some sort of authority to act because it's a crisis and we don't want to have his hands tied. It is really, I think, conceptually hard to argue that a trade imbalance, a trade deficit that has existed every year since 1975 constitutes an emergency or a crisis. On the other hand, the bar for what does constitute a crisis has been lowered over the years. We've talked about this before. I think there are 39 international economic emergencies that currently are in existence. Most of them are not global. Most of them are very specific. So, the standard has been lowered. The bar has been lowered. He would probably do it. I think he would get away with it. There are two other much more obscure provisions of law that he could also use on day one. One is Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974, which is a section that relates to balance of payments imbalances. This was a response to what Nixon did a year or two earlier than the act. What that provision does is allow the president to impose a tariff of up to 15%, which would cover what Trump is talking about, but only for 150 days. It's by law temporary in order to correct a critical imbalance. So he might not find that suitable, since everybody out there would know that it would have to go away after 150 days, and they would probably just wait him out. The third one is Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930, which is a general provision that allows the president to take action against countries that do bad things to us. It really hasn't been used in 70 years, so it's hard to say that there's precedent that we could draw on. I think the problem is on the across-the-board tariff proposal. If you're going to do that, basically you're going to say that every country in the world has been doing something bad to us. And I think that's a stretch of logic, to say the least. So if I were he and I wanted to do this, I would go with IEEPA. Now, if you don't care about day one, then you've got other options. And both of them have a track record in the Trump administration, Section 232 and Section 301. 232 is the national security provision, which he used in steel and aluminum, that requires the president at the end to make a finding that the imports in question, whatever they are a threat to national security. He could do that in this case. It's not a day one thing because by law, there has to be an investigation, that one by the Commerce Department, which has 270 days to send the president a report, who then has 60 days to decide what he's going to do about it. There is a tendency often by the relevant cabinet official there, also in 301 where there's a report, but that's by USTR, not by Commerce, to say, well, we're going to have a hurry up investigation. It won't take the whole time to do our report. We'll do, 60 days, get it done, get it to the president right away. Well, in the steel case where there was some sense of urgency on Trump's part, as I recall, the Commerce Department delivered its report on the 269th day. These things take a lot of time because under the law, there's a process. It's an interagency process. You need to take in comments. You need to listen to people. You need to consult. There's all these various steps that you have to go through. And going through them is a bureaucratic process that simply takes time. So when they say there's 270 days, you can expect them to take pretty close to that before they're going to be ready to send the president a report. It would be, I think, hard to argue that every import from every country in the world constitutes a national security threat, which is supposed to be the predicate for taking an action under 232. So we are importing sunglasses from China. That would be a national security threat under this logic. I think that's hard to sustain, but it's one of the options. The last option is 301, which is what Trump used on the China tariffs before. And the logic for doing it with respect to a specific country is better than the logic to doing it with the whole world. Although even there, it turns the statute on its head. I talked to the person who actually wrote the relevant part of Section 301, which was amended in the Trade Act of 1987. The point of the statute was to say, all right, the United States government is investigating a practice that we think is unfair, unjustifiable, or discriminatory. And we're going to investigate. And if we find that such a practice exists, then the statute contemplates that we will go to the offending country and say, we have a problem that you're causing, and we would like to talk to you about fixing it. And by the way, if you don't talk to us and don't fix it, here's a set of things that we can do to get even, which would include tariffs, among other things. So it's a process of investigate, negotiate, retaliate if there's no satisfactory result. Trump turned that on its head. Instead of ready, aim, fire, it turned it into ready, fire, aim. Investigate, retaliate, and then we negotiate, which is exactly what he did with China. He imposed the tariffs and then said, let's talk about it. This is not the way the statute is supposed to operate. On the other hand, the courts have upheld what he did. So I don't think that if he did it again, it would be particularly vulnerable, at least with respect to China. But again, there would have to be an investigation. I would be surprised if he would want to just do it under the cover of the investigation that he originated now 6 years ago. So new investigation, the USTR has a year to do it. Probably wouldn't take the whole time, but they also would take more than 60 days. And then the president, I think, has 60 days or something, or 30 or 60, to decide what he wants to do. So that is also a possibility. It makes more sense to do that on China tariffs. I mean, the problem with both 232 and 301 is making the argument that an across-the-board tariff against all items from everybody in the world is covered by the statute. That wasn't the point of either statute. You can't make the national security case for everything we import, and you can't make the unfair or unjustifiable argument for everything that we import. But the options are there. He may choose to do that. It really will come down to whether he wants to do something dramatic on day one or, give him a break, day 2, day 3, or if he wants to put in place a process. The advantage of the process is that it might put him in a stronger legal position, although I think an across-the-board tariff would be hard to argue in all of the cases. It might also put him in a stronger position with Congress because these are, in all cases, he's using statutes. But 301 or 2 and 232 are now more commonly used. I think that they might go down better with Congress than the use of IEPA, particularly on a very far-reaching measure. So anyway, going back to the beginning, I think the answer is yes, he can do it. Can he get away with it? Maybe, but certainly for several years while the litigation proceeds, because I doubt that he'd find a judge that was willing to grant an injunction under any of those statutes. Scott?
First, my compliments to the Scholl Chair and to Warren Maruyama for this report. It's a public service, okay? And it's similar to the public service that our friend Gary Huffbauer provided back in 2016 when he did similar research going all the way back to the Trading with the Enemy Act, which was a World War I era statute, and looked at the inherent powers that the president has that are very difficult to curtail by any outside force. And certainly Congress has not repealed any of these statutes or significantly modified them recently. So I think it's pointing that out is important for people who work in the space to understand the president does have a lot of power. Back to our friends at the Congressional Research Service, and note that the IEPA statute was passed in 1977. Since that time, there have been 69 emergencies. Good luck naming more than 5. It's a wonderful Jeopardy question, by the way, for trade people. And Bill correctly mentioned there are 39 that still exist today. CRS points out that the first use of the statute was against Iran when hostages were taken at the U.S. Embassy in Tehran. And it's still operating today. It's in its 5th decade. So the very first use of IEPA continues to enforce till this day. So very powerful set of authorities that the president has. And until 2023, there was not even an attempt by Congress to curtail a specific emergency declaration. That's worth remembering. I also remember Ronald Reagan's aphorism that there's very few things in the world that are quite so permanent as a temporary government program. temporary authorities tend to last for a very long time. I note that in August 1971, President Richard Nixon essentially ordered Treasury Secretary John Connally to close the gold window and stop the convertibility of dollars for gold by foreign sovereigns. There was no statute, there was no order, just an order from the president to take the action temporarily. And here we are 53 years later, and the gold window is still closed. So this is the way things work in Washington. It's important to remind ourselves of that. At the same time, I do think that President Trump showed himself to be a bargainer, that he's looking for leverage. He may do it in a way different than other presidents, but he wants bargaining, he wants reciprocity. And I note that a couple of other friends of this program, Alan Wolf and Doug Irwin, recently published a commentary about whether former President Trump really admires William McKinley and wants to replicate William McKinley as much as he says. William McKinley, president from Ohio, was also chairman of the Ways and Means Committee in his congressional days, but also was a high tariff Republican. So famous for that. And what Doug Irwin and Alan Wolf point out is that maybe President Trump, if he wins office again, will actually be more like Richard Nixon than William McKinley. The Trade Act of 74 was primarily negotiated between the Congress and President Nixon, signed by President Ford. It has that hard bargaining, the reciprocity that's very much a part of Trump's arguments and his comments on the subject. It also contains Section 301, as Bill mentioned. So there are various ways to look at how this might play out politically. But the key is these statutes are alive and well, and while not easy to use, they don't require a lot of further action by anyone else to put them in place. So thanks to the Scholl Chair and everybody who worked on it for doing it. Warren's a very careful analyst. As a former USTR General Counsel, we might expect. But I think it's a paper well worth your attention.
Well, thanks, guys. And again, we encourage you all to go check out that paper. It's not too long on our website, csis.org. Our next paper comes from Phil Levy at the World Bank, who published with the Peterson Institute last week. He's looking into a more retrospective question that has been top of mind for economists, which is why have we experienced sustained inflation since the pandemic, although I should note that it's seemingly slowing. His title is, Did Supply Chains Deliver Pandemic-Era Inflation? So guys, what do you think? Were supply chains the main driver of inflation?
I certainly don't think so, and I don't think the author thinks so either. So I think we agree on that. In some ways, looking at supply chains and their effect on inflation is like the old joke about the man who's looking for his wallet, which he lost under a street lamp. And someone walks up and say, well, where did you lose your wallet? He said, well, in the alley over back there behind this building. And he said, well, why are you looking here under the street lamp? He said, well, because the light's better. This is a person who's done trade economics and is accustomed to looking at trade data, did a lot of the analysis on container movements, things like that. So it's very thorough in that respect. But I think it's sort of like looking for where the light's shining, which may or may not be where the wallet is. In this case, I happen to think that when we think about supply chains, there is an easy assumption to make that I think is almost always wrong. And that assumption is that the way things are done today is the way they must be done. In my view, the way they're done today is subject to a lot of economic forces and practical forces about where assets are and where they need to be, but they can change at the drop of a hat when circumstances change. Because of that, I think supply chains are effect and not cause in general. Don't know if the author would agree with me or not, but my point is, first place to look for the source of inflation is where Milton Friedman might look, which is government action. Well, what happened during the pandemic? Well, first, there was a rapid increase to the supply of dollars. In the early days of the pandemic, this was known as helping create liquidity and preserve liquidity, but we printed a lot of money. So you have the natural fiscal pressure of more dollars chasing fewer goods, which is almost always the textbook definition of inflation. At the same time, the level of fiscal actions also help fuel inflation over the long haul. We think about what happened during the pandemic. First, we restricted the ability of the public to conduct normal operations. People were ordered to stay at home. In fact, we paid them to stay at home for a period of time prior to the broadly available vaccines. We had a number of other effects, that not only were people paid to stay home, but it changed what was consumed, where it was supplied. It changed the relative consumption of goods and services, all with basically zero planning. We did some things reflexively during the early days of COVID that were very difficult to unwind and continued kind of the problems. During the pandemic, Andrew Schwartz and I did a special podcast called The Reopening. And the best part of the podcast was the people we got to talk to. And I well remember the conversation with Ajay Banga, who was CEO at the time, I believe still is CEO of the MasterCard. And the interesting thing about talking to Ajay is he was able to look at what people were actually using their credit cards to buy. And what we saw, of course, was the big shift to goods purchases, and mostly because we closed a lot of services businesses. So government action closed massive parts of the service economy, which is 70 or so percent of GDP, and sent everybody home. And so MasterCard had watched people. Well, first you set up your home office if you're part of the laptop class, again, working from home. So there were immediate technology purchases. And the next thing that happened is people started working on their house. You improve your home office. In fact, I remember talking to him during this podcast about my discovery of latex paint hardener. Latex paint hardener is a chemical, comes in a little bag, and you stir it in a can of paint. It hardens the paint, and you could put a half a can of paint into your normal trash, and it goes to the landfill with everything else very safely. No muss, no fuss, perfectly acceptable to the trash collectors of Montgomery County, Maryland. But it was those kinds of things that people were buying. And his conclusion was, you look at this broadly, people are, making their home and office, then cleaning up their house and fixing things up, spending money on goods that they would have spent on services like restaurants and haircuts and movies and other things. And they were buying it online instead of buying it in bricks and mortar stores. So all these changes disturbed the flow of commerce. And because we were paying people to stay home, many of the people who would have modified and made things work better given the new circumstances weren't around to do it. That's probably the driving force. It was, as Milton Friedman would say, inflation is always a monetary phenomenon. He counseled to look for government action. I think that's what happened. Now, a step back from this, a couple things. One is I would ponder that what we've not done is taken a good look at what worked and didn't during COVID. So if we were to face another pandemic, what would we do? Would we be any smarter? And I do know that two physicians with serious statistics credentials, one at the Stanford Medical School, the other at Harvard Medical School, published a study of studies. And they looked at 100,000 models that show almost nothing that we did during the pandemic demonstrably helped. Quite a striking paper published in Stat News last June. Very thorough and entirely fact-based published. In fact, they went in hoping to find something that looked like a great accommodation or great action to use for the future. And their conclusion was no intervention in normal economies during COVID-19 had much of an effect, positive or negative, on the sort of trajectory and evolution of the virus. So it's an odd circumstance, but I think the first place you've got to look is government action. Levy's paper does explain a lot. He talks about what happened, appeared to be a major shortage in IT products for the automotive sector. I think that was probably a special case because there was overall no shortage in IT chips. In fact, production and distribution increased over the period. What happened is I think the auto companies behaved as if it was a normal downturn, in which case they immediately cut production. And because they have a lot of captive suppliers, they cut orders from all their suppliers. Well, the IT suppliers are not captive. And when the auto companies canceled their orders, the book was immediately filled with other demands, like IT equipment, whose sales increased. And the auto industry, then when they realized the auto demand was not going to decline substantially, they had to scramble to get back in the queue, which for captive suppliers was an easier challenge than the auto companies dealing with the IT suppliers. So there's a lot of wrinkles to this. A lot of supply chain interruptions were frankly people. If you talk to distribution centers, warehouse managers, the real problem with moving goods was getting people to come to work and to do the jobs that were needed. We were short of truckers throughout the pandemic because truck drivers' training schools were closed. So there were a whole series of effects. I think the paper's contribution, it's an interesting look at the mechanics of supply chains, but I think blaming supply chains takes the onus off the absolute failure of almost any government intervention to make a meaningful difference, positive or negative, that we probably would have been better off leaving a lot of things alone or moving toward a focused protection strategy, looking at the most vulnerable and protecting them than the things we did. So we're not talking about that. So perhaps this paper will stimulate a conversation. And I hope we talk about it before the next pandemic happens.
Scott, that's a wonderful summary of both the paper and actually what happened. I had two small thoughts about it. One that I think is deserving some additional discussion some other time. One, this is an example of what, to get nerdy for a minute, is what's called the post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy, which is the idea that because something happened first, it caused the thing that happened second. Which that's why it's a fallacy. Just because it happened first doesn't mean that it was the cause. It just means that it happened first. So the supply chain breakdown happened before the inflation, but that doesn't mean that it caused the inflation. And I think Phil does a good job of explaining why, in this case, it's a fallacy. The second thing that is in there, which is not central, but I thought was interesting, was he reflected kind of a different definition of resilience than most of us are talking about today. And I think that's worthy of mention. From a strictly just economic standpoint, resilience really is a term that means for companies, are they capable of being able to meet unexpected increases in demand? So stockpiling would be resilient, building excess capacity in the expectation that at some point you may need to use the excess capacity is a way to achieve supply chain resilience. And from a strictly economic point of view, that's a logical definition. But it's not quite the same one that we're talking about now in the current political debate, because resilience now has been linked to security. Supply chains need to be resilient, not in order to meet unexpected demand surges. They need to be resilient in order to contend with unexpected supply cutoffs from adversaries. And so resilience has turned into a security word when it didn't used to be one. And that, I think we need to sort of tease that out a little bit more, and there's no time to do that today. But, it kind of, I think, leads you down a different path of analysis about what you're supposed to do, because it doesn't necessarily make you look at building in excess domestic capacity. It encourages you to focus on supply chain choke points and developing workarounds for those choke points or developing redundant capabilities. Now, one could argue that developing redundant capabilities is not much different from maintaining excess capacity at home. But, there are differences. One is maintaining excess capacity here. The other is identifying suppliers anywhere, but not China, and then trying to create relationships with them so that you can continue to function. In a way, it's where they diverge, I guess, is on the question of stockpiling and inventory, just thinking about it. Our production process used to be an inventory-based process where supply chain managers would try to figure out how much they were going to need of something and then buy a bunch of it. They'd have a big warehouse and they would store it. And then they would move it from the warehouse to the assembly facility when they needed it, and everything was fine. That produced excess costs, storage costs, maintenance costs, also theft and destruction if it was a consumable product, rot, things like that. This is well established. The economy evolved toward just-in-time production, where the parts and components you need to build the car in the afternoon arrive in the morning from wherever they would come from, and they don't go to storage. They go directly to the assembly line. And that saves you a lot of money, but it also makes you vulnerable to unexpected developments, shutdowns, supply chain kinks. The classic example was after 9/11 when the Canadian border was shut down for a period of days, which really crippled the auto industry for a time because it was dependent on just-in-time deliveries from Windsor coming across the bridge or through the tunnel. That's a different problem than stockpiling. And I think the current drive toward resilience for security reasons is actually, we may end up in the same place. It's taking us back in the direction of maintaining inventory. And that, like other things in the striving for resilience, is expensive or more expensive than just in time. So basically, we've embarked down a path of non-economic variables intruding into supply chain calculations. And that it probably is inflationary because it's increasing costs. But what Phil really says is that the problem was a demand problem, not a supply problem. And I think he makes a pretty good case about that. And for those of you that are economic wonks out there, I'd encourage you to take a look at the study and make up your mind yourselves.
Okay, that's a wrap, guys. Thank you as always, and we will see you next week.
To our listeners, if you have a question for the Trade Guys, write us at tradeguys@csis.org. That's tradeguys@csis.org. We'll read some of your emails and have the Trade Guys react to it. You've been listening to The Trade Guys, a CSIS podcast.